I'd like to welcome everyone to the Mount Gretna School of Art lecture series. This lecture is in our classroom space at the Heights Community Building tonight. I want to thank the two big sponsors of the lectures this summer. Is the Arts for All partnership as the Foundation for Enhancing Communities and Stinson Stroup. So I'm going to introduce Rachael Wren, who's our visiting critic this week for the students. She's coming down from Brooklyn, where she lives and paints in New York City. She attended the University of Washington for her MFA and got her undergrad degree from the University of Pennsylvania. She's had a couple of recent shows at the Painting Center and Equity Gallery in New York, along with a show at Jeffrey Young in Massachusetts.
Hi, everyone. It's good meeting some of you today. And thanks, Jay, for having me. Yeah. So I'm going to start by showing you my most recent work that I've finished over the last year and a half or so. And kind of talk to you about some of the ideas behind the work. And then I'll go back in time and kind of show you sort of how I came to be making these things over a lot of years and different stages that the paintings went through. So let's see, this is called Double Bind. It's 30 by 30 inches. It's oil on linen. It is one of my most recently finished paintings. And I see the work as combining elements of landscape and elements of geometric abstraction. And I think of those as two very different ways of working with painting and thinking about painting ideas, and also just two different approaches to life. So the geometry is kind of the rational, the ordered, the planned out, and the landscape is the more intuitive and emotional and random to some degree. So when I think about geometry, for me, that's always connected to drawing. And I usually start off with a grid. And I think about kind of where I'm going to place the what I think of as verticals or trees, within that grid. So the geometry is connected to the structure of a painting. And I always think that the stronger the structure of the painting is, then the more freedom there is for the atmosphere to play around within it. So for me, the grid kind of keeps things anchored. And then there's color, on the other hand, which is connected to landscape for me. And I always think when I'm kind of starting a painting, I usually think about some color combination that I've seen in nature that I want to work with as a starting point. And sometimes that idea will stay for the whole time that I'm making the painting. And sometimes it changes a lot and it's just a jumping off point and the painting goes somewhere else. But for me, sort of having that initial impulse of a real place or real moment in mind sort of helps me keep the painting connected to a lived experience. This one's called Veil. It's 36 by 36 inches. They're all oil on linen. So there we go. And this is a detail. So this kind of shows you a little bit more of the buildup of some of the marks that I use. Each mark is its own individual shape of color. Those little flowery things are sort of two filbert brush marks kind of crossing each other. Then there's some flat marks under there. And then the other thing is that you might see some greens behind there. So this painting sort of started out all green, and then it changed a lot over the course of making it. So I work layer by layer with these different small marks, and I never really know at the beginning what it's going to look like at the end. I kind of start off with an idea about a color relationship, usually 2 or 3 colors, and I put them down, and then I sort of respond to what's there. So I never really know how many layers it's going to take to get there, and what they're going to be. Even though I think sort of at the end they look planned out, they're really not, and I can never think more than 1 layer ahead. And I just sort of keep going until these individual pieces of color seem to cohere into some sort of atmosphere. And this is a detail of that one. I like the idea that, again, it's like each piece is its own color with its own like crisp defined edge, but together they create something more hazy. This one's called Groundswell. It's 4 by 4 feet. And I think like by using the same kind of brush strokes all over the canvas, I'm trying to weave together the form and the space. I've always been really interested in the idea that in painting, you have to give space, like a form and a color. You can't just leave it empty or unconsidered. And in my paintings, I want the space to feel as real as an object. This one's called Hindsight. It's 36 by 36 inches. And I pretty much always work in a square format. And I think for me, like it feels like the most expansive shape. I know some artists have the opposite experience where it feels really confining, but for me, it feels like I can just move out equally in all directions, which I really like. And it also sort of reiterates the geometry that I'm working with. Using the grid kind of returns you to the surface of the square. And then also I talked to some people about, like what shape landscape is today, horizontal, vertical. And for me, trying to put it into a square kind of gives the idea that I'm not really trying to reproduce what's out there, but I'm using something of the landscape to make my own constructions. And I think like, with all of this, I'm trying not to capture what the landscape actually looks like, but what it feels like, and create some sort of evocative experience that's hopefully similar to what you might get from being outside, a sense of slowing down, breathing deeper. And I think like the layers and the time that's kind of embedded in the paintings hopefully comes back out at the viewer as they're looking at them and kind of helps you to slow down and have that experience. So that was all the new stuff, and I'm going to go back in time. So this was about 20 years ago when I was a graduate student at the University of Washington, and I started painting in the landscape. So before that, I had been in kind of just like working in the studio, painting still lifes, painting little models that I would set up for myself. I was always really interested in how you move through the space of a painting. And so I guess towards the end of my first year in grad school, I thought, okay, it makes sense to go outside and kind of explore a bigger space. And I was in Seattle, which was very beautiful. And so I found this park called Ravenna Park, and I ended up going and painting there like almost every day for the next more than a year. So I think, trying to kind of think back and remember what it felt like to work there in the park, I do remember that feeling of bigness of the landscape that was really different from working with the still lives. In the studio, I was like the big one, and I was just sort of like outside of and on top of the thing that I was painting. But then as soon as I went out into the landscape, like I was the small one, and then my subject was towering over me. I mean, I like that. I really like that feeling of being immersed in the thing that I was working with. So with the first few paintings that I did in this park, I was thinking a lot about how to move into the backspace. And it was tricky to figure out because there was no ground plane. The place where I was a path that kind of went down into a ravine, and the trees were growing up out of them. So I couldn't really see the tops or the bottoms of them. And it was just this cross section of trunks and branches. And I was trying to, figure out how to make them work spatially. I was also really thinking about how to break up what I was seeing into these like small marks of color and use like this similar brushstroke in the spaces and on the trees. And that was definitely the beginning of the ideas that I'm still working with today. These paintings are about 20 inches or so a little smaller. And the colors that I was using were based somewhat on observation and somewhat on invention. I think I was starting to become aware that I was trying to paint this like sense of place that I kind of carried inside of me. And it didn't really have like its own visual form. So I was using the trees as something to hang it on. And when I was kind of thinking about like, well, what that was, it always felt like it was this green, gray, atmospheric, kind of dense space that felt comforting to be in. And I felt like I was kind of like using the trees as a vehicle to express something about that internal space. This is another one. And I was trying to let this space dissolve the trees more and more. And so things, started to become more abstract. I was really thinking about like how much is necessary to put in the painting to convey, what I want. And then at that time, I was also drawing in the studio. So I did all the painting outside on site. And then I would take them back to my studio and start drawing from them. And I think, that helped me do some things that I wasn't doing in the paintings. I would use these like fuzzier marks to create the atmosphere. This is another one. I think it was sort of let myself go more towards abstraction. And also leave more empty spaces. And I'll show you some artists who I was looking at this point. This is Jake Berteau. I really loved the way that his work combined nature and geometry. It's one of his drawings. So I was looking at him a lot. And then Agnes Martin, I was reading her writings and just love the idea that even though her work was so geometric and minimal, she really saw it as connected to nature. And I also would have that feeling kind of standing in front of these paintings that they had something like way past what you can see in a JPEG, certainly. And then Andrew Forge was another really important painter. Just how he was able to put together these little dots of color to create an overall field. And so those are three artists who I was looking at then and who have really stayed touchstones for me and who I kind of just like keep on coming back to. So after Seattle, I stayed there for a year after graduate school, was working and teaching and painting. And then I moved to Providence, Rhode Island. Had a teaching job there. And I thought when I moved that I would just pretty much keep on working the same way that I had been. I'd find like a place outside and just go paint there. But that didn't really end up happening. So what did happen was that I found some woods called Lincoln Woods that I liked a lot. But I never painted there. I would do a lot of sketching there. And then I brought those little drawings back to the studio and tried to paint from them. So this is one of those paintings. This is about 16 by 16 inches, not very big. This is like one of the sketches that I did on site. It's another one. And, the horizontal lines in the sketches became a way of looking horizontally to kind of counteract the verticality of the trees. So I would find a place where something happened, like where two branches crossed each other. And then I would like look across horizontally and see like, okay, what else happens on that line? So that was sort of how I got to be making these drawings. And then that just sort of came right back into the paintings. And I think, working or painting away from observation sort of changed a few things. The color was a little bit more inventive. The way I was using the marks was different. And then also there was a ground plane in these paintings, which sort of changed the way that you move through them. There was that sort of like more of a sense of perspective at the bottom, but then also a bit of more of a flattening out at the top with the horizontal lines and the marks just kind of hanging on them. And I think that sort of tension between the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional is something that I've been interested in for a long time. I mean, I think it's a kind of like a fundamental painting question that a lot of people deal with. And I know it just keeps on intriguing me. These are some drawings that I was doing kind of like right just from the paintings. I think like I would get stuck with the paintings a lot because it was really like the first time that I wasn't working directly from observation. I didn't know exactly what to do. So I just start drawing from the paintings, and then I would use the drawings to help me go back into them. So those two things sort of developed together. So I lived in Providence for about a year, and then I moved to Brooklyn. And when I first got there, I was working on paintings similar to what I had been doing in Providence. These are a little bigger, about 25 inches or so. And it felt like I didn't really need the landscape anymore. Things would happen in one painting that would open up a question to be addressed in the next. So I was really just like only in the studio at that point and not really looking outside of it. But I think, at some point I sort of felt like there was something that was still too literal. There was like the brown trees and the blue sky. And for a while I wasn't really sure what to do. And I remember just sort of like painting things in and painting them out and, just trying to figure it out. And then one day I sat down and I made this drawing. This is probably like 8 inches or so. And I remember thinking like, well, it's really just a grid. Anybody could do that. I don't know. I just don't know. But I think like there was probably some part of me that knew there was something there because I hung it up in the studio and I just kept looking at it. I did a couple other similar ones, just sort of like playing around with that idea. It's like a little painting. And then I did this drawing, which seemed like it brought together some elements of those little grid ones and elements of the trees, where there was like geometry and atmosphere. And then after that, like things really changed a lot in the paintings. So the trees like pretty much went away and weren't really even trees anymore. And I started building up the paintings out of all the same brush mark. This is the detail of that one, as you can see. It's the mark, it kind of looks like a jelly bean. It's made with a filbert brush, sort of going in one direction and then the other. And it's the same, kind of the same one all over the whole canvas with different colors. This is another one. This one's called Dwell. These are, I think, also around, but somewhere between like 25 and 30 inches. Sort of like medium scale. I was still like for color, still thinking back to like landscape and atmosphere. And that was always kind of like a way in for me. And I think like there were some paradoxes in these paintings. I felt that by limiting things, like I was limiting the mark, I was kind of going in and the horizontal lines, that sort of started in those paintings in Providence turned into this like regular grid with sort of repeating intervals. And somehow by like kind of putting those limits in, other things got freer. It was like the sense of color expanded and the sense of like just the mark sort of like jumping around felt a little bit different than what I had done before. And some surprising things happened too. When I was thinking about the structures for these paintings, like how they would work spatially, I would sort of plan them out with little sketches and pencil in my sketchbook. And I always thought of this space as working sort of in a linear perspective. But as I started adding the color, it sort of did this like curving, warping thing, which I really wasn't expecting, but it was kind of an interesting surprise. This one's called Precipice. And I think it's hard for me to say if they were landscapes anymore. I think some part of me was always thinking of them as landscapes, but I think they also became somewhat more like industrial or city-like or buildings. This is an example of a sketch that I did to sort of kind of plan out where things were going to go. So similar to what I do now, it's the structure is the thing that I find through drawing. And then color just always changes it. So this is the painting that came out of that little sketch. As I got more comfortable with that way of working and seeing like what different color relationships could do, I started thinking about like the painting as a light source. Could it feel like it was really glowing? So there's that. that one. You know, again, it's like the means are really restricted, but within that, how can I keep on pushing it so I don't feel like I'm doing the same thing in every painting? And then I started doing some bigger ones. So this is about 4 by 4 feet, but still with the same little mark. That's the detail of it. And so the big ones would take a really long time to make. They just kind of like develop slowly, like layer by layer. I was thinking a lot about color theory stuff, I guess, like saturated colors next to unsaturated ones, and thinking about like how that would create this sort of visual vibration. That's another one. And I sort of like the fact that they took so long to make. It just felt like the time, like in the paintings and in the studio, was really different than time anywhere else. And I wanted them to be things that would take you or the viewer like a long time to look at also, and that the more you look at, the more you see, and hopefully they sort of keep unfolding and you keep on discovering more about the color or the patterns in there. So while I was working on the big ones, I was also doing these small ones. This is 8 by 8 inches. And it's that same little brush mark. It's oil painting on gessoed paper. And I'm just sort of thinking about like, okay, what other kind of like spaces or kind of like optical effects can happen when I don't overlap the marks. Also color theory stuff, you know, like the background in here is the same, but it looks different depending on what the marks are on top of it. They got a little more complicated because I got really like fascinated by what, you know, just these kind of like straight-ish lines could do, how they got so curvy and so optical. And they were like really fun to make. And what I liked with them was that I kind of had a plan, like I knew what I was going to do, but I didn't know what they would look like. So it was like I had to kind of like make the whole thing in order to see what it would actually do. But I think like after a while with them, I started to feel like they wouldn't sustain me over the long haul, you know, that I had kind of like gone a little bit too far away from like emotional connection that I had with painting, which to me was always landscape. And so I started thinking about like how I could get the landscape back. You know, while still also being true to these other things that I had discovered. So this is the first painting that tried to like bring the landscape back and kind of like integrate it with the geometry. This is called Echo. So, you know, the sky kind of came back a little bit and felt like more landscapey colors. I used a few different size brushes. Used a flat brush maybe for the first time, which seemed like a big deal. Yeah, that's just a detail of it. This is another one. See, these last two are 4 by 4 feet. This one's called Grove. And I started thinking, this one's called Midwinter. I started thinking back to like really specific places or moments in time and trying to use those colors in the kind of system of geometry that I had set up. And that, you know, that was just sort of, it helped me to have that connection to something, again, like outside of the paintings, outside of the optical stuff. Sort of more of like an emotional feeling that I was going after. And I think after a bit with these, I started noticing like, okay, for a long, long time, everything has always been in order, kind of like big to small or light to dark. But that's not really how it is in nature. In nature, it's all mixed up. Like there'll be like a skinny tree next to a fat one and like a small thing next to a big one. And so like, what would it look like if I tried to bring that into the work? So I started doing some drawings, you know, that explored that idea. This is just ink wash. And I was really interested in how landscapey they got again, considering the fact that they were just vertical bands of different shades of gray. And then that sort of led me back into the paintings in a bit of a different way. thinking again about how to like mix up the thick, the thin, what was coming forward, what was going back. And when I did that with the paintings, I also changed the relationship of the space around the trees. So it had been before that, like the light to dark would sort of go with the trees. And here I started to make it go from top to bottom. And then that made the color relationships a little bit more challenging and more interesting. And then I also started adding some diagonal lines as part of the grid to sort of, just show connections between things and emphasize the ground plane in a different way. This one's called Mirage. This is also 4 by 4 feet. And that's a detail of it. This one is called Memory Catcher. So kind of finding like different structures, just using that idea of like, okay, mixing up what's going to go where, and help to create different kinds of spaces. That one is called Endless Season. And let's see, this one's called Lost and Found. And I think, I was feeling like I got a lot of things that I wanted in there. It's a little bit landscapey, it's a little bit geometry-y. The color is kind of interesting. And I think, it's like when you get to that place of feeling like you know what you're doing a little bit, it's time for something to change. I didn't know exactly what needed to change. I just sort of felt like I had figured something out, and then it's like, okay, what comes next? So it's probably about 3 years ago. And I started doing some watercolor drawings, which I had really never done before. And that kind of got me thinking about atmosphere in a bit of a different way, not using the kind of solid marks that I was used to using. That's another one. So same, similar structures, but just trying to find different ways of approaching them. And then the other thing that I started doing was these collages with colored paper. And I remember sitting down and thinking like, oh yeah, collage is going to be great. It's going to help me like move through some ideas more quickly. Like it sort of simplifies some things. And these ended up taking so long and being so painstaking that I just had to laugh at myself, because it's like I can't do anything fast if I want to. But it did show me some new things about color. Like I kept all the tree parts the same color. And in this one, the kind of like thinner orange verticals are the same from top to bottom. And I think there was just a little bit more of a freedom with like using this like cut paper. I used these like longer horizontals. It was definitely one of those cases where like I really didn't know why I was doing this, but I just kept doing it. That was another one. But it proved to be worthwhile because it sort of led me back into the paintings that I started with. And I didn't even realize like what similarities there were, honestly, until I kind of put this together the other day. And I was like, oh, those collages really informed like the last group of paintings that I was making. And that's kind of back to the beginning. So there's my evolution of many years. And let's see, things that I'm thinking about kind of moving forward in the studio are questions that might seem obvious, like what happens if you don't paint the trees vertical? What if they kind of go a little bit diagonal off the grid, a little crazy? And also like some leafy things are starting to come into some of the stuff that I'm working on now. So like I'm definitely a slow painter. Things like move slowly, but it does feel like there's, I don't know, like an evolution that that hopefully keeps on happening and keeps things interesting. Yeah, and I guess the other thing I would say is that sort of like looking back, and putting together like all these years of work, it feels really logical. But going through it, it doesn't feel that way. It's like while you're making it, like I never know what the next thing's going to be. So there you go. That's pretty much it.
So the diagonals are really interesting to me because they look like they're both behind and in front of the space. Is that something that you left uncovered from the ground, or is that something you go in and have?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of forgot to say. So with the grid, I always start just with like, I kind of rule it out with pencil, and then I paint it over with whatever color I think might be useful, because the pencil will like get erased or smudged unless I do that. And then I start painting, the marks on top of it. But I always end up painting the grid back in like at least 3 or 4 times while I'm making the painting because it gets covered up. And I try to end where it's like partly visible and partly underneath. So it's kind of like woven in there. I want you to be able to see it. Sometimes like, it has happened where like I'll kind of paint the grid back in and then be like, you know what, like, I don't think I need to paint anything else on this. And so like it's on top, but I try to have it sort of half in and half out.
How large were your drawings? You showed several different ones and they looked large.
No, they're pretty small. I mean, the largest of them is probably like 18 inches. So I'd say like anywhere from like 6 to 18 inches.
And were your watercolors, are they in that range?
Oh, those are like about 12 inches. They're pretty small. Yeah.
Can you discuss your limitations a little bit, like how you decide what you're going with?
Yeah, so I guess like the first big limitation was when I started using just that like filbert mark. I don't even really remember like why it was that one. Maybe it felt like if you made it kind of straight, it had like a straight part and a curvy part, and that seemed, like it wouldn't be too angular. I don't know. Somehow that so in a way like that, and then it's like that's one thing I don't have to think about. I know like I have my like many versions of my number 4 filbert brush, and I don't have to think about it. So then I can spend more time like thinking about color, things like that, I guess. Like, and then I don't know, I guess I also like having those limitations to push against and see like, okay, within a particular structure, like how can I, make something new happen? Yeah.
Do you limit your palette as well, or do you let yourself use whatever you think is necessary?
My usual palette is it's mostly like the primary colors. I'll have like three yellows, 3 reds, 3 blues. And then I have like tons of other colors also. And I usually pick out the ones that I want for whatever painting I'm working on. So it's not very limited. Like in each painting, I'm trying to go after a particular like color sense. Yeah.
I'm curious, you might have said this, I got 2 questions.
Yeah.
The first one, I'm curious what you use as like a medium, or if you do. And then the other one is, I'm curious, and you might have said this, but like how long you work on these?
No, okay, so the medium I use it's like about half terpenoid, half linseed oil. At one point I was doing the like 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 with Damar, and then I just like took the Damar out and didn't seem to matter. It doesn't make the paint shiny. Like I want the paint to be pretty matte, so that the like feeling of light is from the color interactions and not from shiny paint. And I work on them for months, but I work on a lot at a time, like usually at least like 5 or 6 kind of going on at the same time. And part of that is because, with like, if I'll put down like a layer, it's oil paint. So I need to wait a few days for it to dry before I put the next layer on. So I need to have other things to work on, but also like, I genuinely like don't know what I'm going to do usually, like when I put down like one layer of color, and it takes me a while to think about like, okay, what should the next layer be? Yeah. And then, there's a lot of times where like I'll get something to a certain point and I know it needs more, but I just don't know what it is. And so it'll like hang around for a couple months and I won't do anything to it, and then all of a sudden I'll know.
So do you ever have like the palette completely change from like the beginning of the painting to the end of the painting? Like maybe you're working with browns and greens and yellows.
More times than I can tell you.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's one I showed in the beginning that was kind of blue and purple, and it had started off like all green. And there was another one close to the beginning that was like red and white, and that actually started off turquoise, which was kind of there's some turquoise like still in it, kind of like peeking through. So they do change a lot. Not always, but it has happened more than once. Yeah.
I was wondering if you ever brought this, Mark making micro paintings to like. Have you ever thought of maybe doing a figure or like using the same kind of marker or kind of?
I mean, I definitely did my fair share of like figure drawing and figure painting and all that stuff. And I realized like, I'm just not really interested in painting the figure. It's like, I think like some people like really want to, and some people don't. I don't know. For me, it's like I was saying, that sort of like emotional connection where I get somewhere is through landscape. And so, these are landscape-y, I guess. And that's, there's something there for me that I just, I don't really find in the figure. But, it's like other people have the exact opposite experience.
So you said that the initial impulse for these paintings comes from a real place. And then I saw a lot of your sketches were very focused on the geometric aspects. So do you ever do sketches of the real places, or where is that real place?
So it's the color usually more than like what the place looks like. And the color, I mean, it can kind of pop out anywhere. I'll be just like walking around and like some color combination like pops out at me. I mean, it usually is related to nature. It's like the way like the edge of a tree will look against the sky at a particular time of day. And it'll just like be something that I remember and like, I want to start with those colors, that kind of a thing. So the actual places or that sense of like trees or forest, that's not real at all, but it's the color that's connected to the real place.
I feel like the visual consumption of the city influences how you see the landscape.
Oh, that's a really good question. I probably, and I think not only that, but I have been thinking also about like digital stuff also, because I think, there is a sense of like, oh, they're made out of like small pieces of color, just like pixels. And, I wonder like if I had never seen, understood digital technology, would I be making stuff like this? So like, I feel like it's hard to say, I think everything you're surrounded with affects you to some degree. So I'd say probably yes. But I also, definitely seek out like times of like being away from the city and, looking at real trees and things like that.
Yeah, your work has really strong textile sensibility, and I was wondering if there were any fiber artists or textile designers that you've been looking at.
No, but I love the idea of, trying to make it into something like that. Yeah, I mean, I think about it as like a weaving of space. So that makes sense to me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.